We are really excited to have Dr. Kat Biddle, who is the Associate Professor of Educational Leadership at the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Maine, as our keynote. And Kat's got a very deep understanding of rural schools, and she's been involved in a number of collaboratives over the years. And most recently, she's been helping out with a couple of collaboratives that have involved island schools, including Portrait of a Graduate work that's happening in Vinyl Haven and also East Grand School, and the Community Learning for Me website, which we heard about from Val this morning. She's also recently co-authored a report called What Can We Learn from the Innovation of Maine Districts to Support Remote Student Learning from March to June 2020, and she's going to be sharing a bunch of the research that she's done about that. And one of the things that really resonates for me with Kat's work is how much she understands rural communities, both kind of from the emotional heart side and then also from the more hard research side. So she's been a great thought partner and just somebody to learn from, thinking about how we can use all of our resources in our communities, how we can address issues of inequity, how we can support non-traditional learners, and bring everyone, whether it's youth or parents or community members, into the learning, so it isn't just on the school. So I always learn a ton, Kat, when I hear you speak, and I'm thrilled to have you today, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Yvonne. Gosh, that was just the nicest introduction. I'm just gonna share my screen here. Let's see. All right, can everybody see that? All right. Well, I just want to say thank you so much to the Island Institute for having me. Yvonne invited me to do this keynote back in February, which, as you might remember, if you can even remember back that far, was like a totally different time, the before times. At the time, I was working in my role at UMaine on research related to how rural schools and organizations partner to support students' basic needs and create healthy developmental environments for rural young people across their communities, which is kind of where my heart is and the thing I'm most passionate about. And when I wasn't doing that, I was teaching the folks in our master's and doctoral programs at UMaine, mostly principals, superintendents, and teacher leaders. And I know I don't have to tell all of you this, but what I hear from them and what I've experienced myself is that the last 6 months has been really rough. So I'll just give you a little window into my own life. I suddenly found myself in March letting my 4-year-old son watch more TV than I ever thought was possible, while I was like trying to simultaneously hold it down at work and being a preschool teacher, which it turns out I'm not like particularly good at, despite being an educator. Just the kind of uncertainty of the news every day and just weathering that. And this summer, my son, Nate, who calls COVID-19, the sickness, told me angrily, "Mama, I just want to go somewhere where the sickness isn't." And I thought helplessly, yeah, I want to go to New Zealand too, bud. So Twitter delivered this drawing to my newsfeed recently, which was made by a first grader in Pennsylvania to express their feelings about the current state of the world. And I have to say, the thing that got me was the anthropomorphized computer. After a full day of Zoom meetings, I too feel like my computer might be laughing evilly while I lie helpless and fatigued underneath it. But the other thing that I really appreciated about this drawing was the reassurance that she wrote at the top. I think we could all use a reminder that sometimes it's okay to be overwhelmed by school, because so many of us are right now. And for me, those feelings of helplessness are, kind of ever present. And they're definitely what I hear so many of my students struggling right now as we look around at our world. That feeling that there's just so much that's out of our control. And the problems that we're facing, are big. White Americans are grappling with the social implications of systemic racism at a scale that we haven't seen in recent history. We've got parents that are trying to keep their kids safe. We've got schools that are trying to keep their community safe. And as a society, we're trying to balance the security of people's livelihoods against their lives. And for me, the warning sign that I've spent too much time doom scrolling on my phone is when that apathy starts to set in, that feeling that it doesn't matter what I do, that the world is still going to be inequitable and that people are still going to suffer. And at those times, I found a phrase from writer and trainer Paul Gorski of the Equity Literacy Institute that helps to keep me grounded and refocus my energy. So he says, strive to become a threat to inequity within your sphere of influence. And there are two things that I like about this phrase. The first is that it focuses me on a goal that resonates very deeply with my values as an educator, becoming a threat to inequity. And the second is that it helps me to reframe my reality by focusing me on defining my sphere of influence in order to do that. So in service of helping us all kind of take stock of how we already are or we can be a threat to inequity within the context of our work. And that could be our work in the school, it could be our work in a community organization, or it could just be in our everyday lives. I want to spend a little time talking first about what it is that we're up against right now in rural Maine and the broader cultural and historical forces that have gotten us here. And then I want to spend a little time talking about what it means to be a threat to inequity and how we can define our own sphere of influence in the context of these hard times that we find ourselves in. So let's start at the beginning. Where are we right now in rural Maine and how did we get here? So when I describe what I study to others, I often use the term spatial inequality, meaning the ways in which opportunity and disadvantage are distributed across different places. And so in my research, I focus on the way that this distribution tends to disadvantage rural people in rural places and the relationship of education to that inequality. Because in education, we have this long history of thinking of rural schools through a very particular lens. And to understand this, we actually have to go back about 100 years to the period between 1910 and 1920. Because during this time, as the quote unquote kind of modern school system was starting to come together much as it is today. And what I mean when I say modern school system is, grades and multi-room schools and specialized teachers and administrators who are trained in leading schools. Education reformers at that time started turning their attention to the one-room schoolhouses that still existed in rural America. And at that time, electrification and rural infrastructure was weak and uneven. Rural economies experienced fluctuations and youth were leaving the countryside to find work in the city and away from the farm, right? All of those things probably sound pretty familiar to us today. And the reformers at the time saw all of this and they added to that list, what they saw as the quote unquote backwardness and parochialism and lack of education in rural communities as an impediment to their modern vision of schooling. And they coined a term that kind of like tied all of this up in a bow, which was the rural school problem. And these reformers saw all kinds of challenges to implementing their modern vision of schooling in rural America. They couldn't attract enough teachers to fill their graded classrooms who wanted to live in rural places. And they couldn't get communities to pay for their modern school buildings. And so one reformer at the time put it like this. He said, the challenges of the rural school consist of a lack of carefully trained and experienced teachers, short terms of school, poorly constructed schoolhouses, insufficient equipment, annual or semi-annual change of teachers, enrollment too small for best results, many grades and small classes, limited social opportunities for teachers, inconvenient boarding places, teachers not in touch with the life of the community, and a community not vitally interested in the schools. So that was 1910. If that doesn't sum up so much of the way that we talk about these challenges today, I really don't know what does. And so you can see that in this way of looking at schooling, rurality itself becomes a problem for the way that we do education. The problem is rurality, not the way that we're doing schooling. And so you can imagine that some people might have looked at those challenges and said, well, maybe we need to design schools that better fit the strengths of those places, rather than trying to fit these communities into our urbanized model of schooling. But as we know, That's not what happened. And so there have been all kinds of downstream effects over the course of the century that are related to this fundamental design issue. You know, we've got school enrollments that are too small in rural places. Well, let's just consolidate those schools. Or we've got administration overhead that's too high. Well, let's consolidate those districts too. And that isn't to say that the attention to the rural school problem was all bad. You know, at the turn of the 20th century, when attention to rural education was at its height, there were plenty of rural teacher preparation programs that were designed to encourage people to teach in rural communities. And there were departments of rural education at colleges and universities that were just devoted to the study of rural schools. And there was robust debate on the best curriculum for students from rural areas, including many people advocating for curriculum that put children in touch with the places that they lived in meaningful ways and encouraged them to stay in or return to those places. But from an education policy perspective, the words of one reformer, Elwood Cubberley, continued to seem to hold, that what is good for city schools should also be good for rural schools. And we see that play out in all kinds of ways today. So meanwhile, one of the things we know is that the circumstances of rural America have changed pretty profoundly since the modern school system was introduced. So in the mid-1960s, one of the reasons that the Johnson administration enacted their war on poverty was in part because of a report entitled "The People Left Behind," which documented a rural poverty rate that was almost twice the urban poverty rate at the time. And we all know how much the economy of Maine, you know, our rural state, has changed over the course of the past century. So the paper industry is one example, but there are others, you know, manufacturing of all kinds, the transition towards the service sector and tourism. And all of these changes have been hard on our rural communities that are often more economically vulnerable because they have historically had less diversified local economies. And so one of the side effects of this has been the increasing prominence and importance of the school in rural places. As one of the most robust remaining social institutions that's public and one of the primary sites of human capital development, schools are often called the heart of rural communities. And I've done research across a bunch of different states, and I hear the same thing no matter what community I go to. You know, the school is the heart of this place. But one of the things that I've really come to respect is the complexity of the heart. You know, we often think of the heart as a symbol, but actually hearts are these complex systems. And schools as community institutions are incredibly complex systems. The well-being of both schools and communities in rural places are deeply intertwined. And so these are just some of the ways in which the goals of the school as an institution are dependent on the well-being of local community, and the vitality of local communities are dependent on the schools. And one of the biggest trends that we've seen in the last 2 decades, as schools have been held accountable for student achievement under No Child Left Behind and now under the Every Student Succeeds Act, is the increasing integration of wraparound services into the school building itself. So meals and clothes and food pantries and checkups and mental health services. Because one of the things that we've realized is that we have to address the needs of the whole child in order to hold students to the rigorous expectations that those policies are holding schools accountable for. And nationally, at the same time, unfortunately, as we've ramped our attention up to school outcomes, we've also started privatizing risk for families across the country and eroding the social safety net. And so schools end up having to pick up the slack to meet the goals for which we're holding them accountable. And so that brings us to now, to the sudden spring building closure, and to this fall, which I know is characterized by hybrid schooling and in-person schooling and remote schooling all at the same time in some cases. And one of the things that I think every educator realized right away, right, this is not a mystery to any of us, was that when traditional schooling was disrupted by efforts to curb COVID-19, that was going to compound many of the pre-existing inequities that educators have been working hard to overcome in their communities. So this brings me to this question of what we're up against right now. And so a couple of national studies that were released over the summer looking at spring 2020 building closure confirm a couple of things. So first, that what is driving educational inequity in the context of this pandemic is parent education levels, family income, access to devices and the internet, and structural racism. And when we look at these drivers, right off the bat, what jumps out is the way in which 3 out of the 4 of these are deeply tied to the structure of opportunity where you live. And in some ways, structural racism is as well, although it's more complicated. So in essence, these inequities are deeply related to spatial inequality. And this isn't just about rural places. Obviously, these inequities exist for folks who live in cities too, and the ways in which opportunities are structured there. And before I get into the data that I want to share with you today, which is brand new, I want to talk about that 4th factor for a second, structural racism. Because as most of you probably recall, this summer, Maine received the dubious distinction of having the most inequitable COVID infection rates by race in the country. So all people of color in Maine have infection rates that are higher than their proportion within the population. But in June, Black Mainers constituted almost a quarter of all Maine cases, despite being 1% of the population. So this data highlights the critical importance of looking at all issues of equity through an intersectional lens, or in this case, a lens that acknowledges that opportunity can be distributed inequitably across both space and race, and that those inequalities, spatial inequality and structural racism, together produce new barriers for folks in marginalized groups in our society. So in this case, recognizing that those differences together are literally a matter of life and death for these members of our Maine communities. So this brings me to my current project. One of the things that I've always been attracted to understanding is rural innovation. So understanding the resilience and adaptability of rural communities, because despite all of the things that I just talked about, I know that rural educators are finding creative ways to make a school system that is expected to do too much and wasn't designed for their communities work for kids in their classrooms every day. So when the news started to come out about all the innovative things the districts were doing to try to meet the needs of students in the context of building closure and the barriers that they were facing to doing that, I wanted to understand how widely these various strategies were being used and how district leaders were making sense of the vast amount of uncertainty that they were facing. So my colleague Maria Franklin and I proposed a 2-phase study of these efforts, with one phase that focused on the breadth of the services that were being provided, which is what I'm going to share with you today. And a second phase that took a deep dive look at district decision-making about what services to provide. And that is the phase that we're actually just about to begin. So back in the spring, when we started all of this, we didn't have the benefit of the studies that came out over the summer. So we had to use what we knew from the existing research on the conditions that enable learning to theorize what might be affected when you take the school building out of the equation. And we used those as a guide for what kind of services and supports we looked for from schools as they communicated with families and their broader community about their operations during the shutdown. And we focused on these 3 domains: the environmental, the emotional, and the physical. So then in May and June, we collected all publicly available communication from websites and social media feeds of Maine school districts between March 2020 and June 2020. And that resulted in information from 94% of Maine's districts, or 187 districts. So then we went through all of that information and we built this statewide data set on what schools did looking through those documents. And we pulled in data from the CDC to look at relative cases by county. And we also pulled data on district racial demographics and the number of students participating in free and reduced price lunch programs, and also district urbanicity. So what you're looking at here is an overview of Maine school district demographics. And mostly this is just for reference when I get to the next few slides. And there's nothing radical here, okay? I think we all probably could intuit what these pie charts say. The first one, you can see that the overwhelming majority of Maine school districts are classified as rural. And not being from Maine and not having done a study particularly like this before, I actually was surprised at just how many districts are rural. So I thought it was worth sharing. The second pie chart is the breakdown of Maine school districts by percent of students of color. So most school districts in Maine, as you can see, have fewer than 10% students of color in their school populations, while a little less than 20% have between 11 and 50% students of color. And finally, this third pie chart shows the distribution of districts in Maine by free and reduced lunch program participation, which is often used as a proxy measure for low socioeconomic status. So about 85% of districts in Maine have more than a quarter, or 1 in 4 students participating in the program, and almost 40% have 1 in 2 students participating in the program. But I think one of the important caveats here is that, particularly when it comes to family economic circumstances, the landscape has been changing rapidly. So rapidly that our understanding of what families in our communities are facing could be far different than the most recent data that we have. So when you look at the economic circumstances of rural families nationally, Maine is actually doing pretty well by comparison, but still our overall unemployment rate in the state right now is still twice what it was before COVID. So as you can imagine, many family circumstances have been altered significantly. So what did we find about what schools did? Well, mostly, particularly around meal provision, what we found was this story of incredible hope and communities coming together on multiple fronts. So one of the big triumphs from the spring that I insist that the media has not made a big enough deal of is that with a few practical exceptions, every district in Maine started providing food to students within 3 days of building closure. And one of the first innovations that caught my attention was the use of school district buses in remote rural areas to provide food to students on a daily basis. And that doesn't seem radical to us now because, we're 6 months into this, but at the time, someone came up with that and it spread like wildfire, right? So I know that there were regulatory hurdles that had to be overcome to do this, and that the Department of Education and school districts worked hard to come up with workarounds. And in this table, you see mostly what you would expect, right? That meal distribution strategies were more skewed towards pickup in more urbanized areas, and more districts opted for delivery the further you get from an urban center. So another triumph, although this is one that certainly could and should be expanded, is that 1/3 of all districts went above and beyond just providing meals to students. They made sure that families also had access to information about food pantries and other community organizations providing meals, because parents were the new teachers and they needed food security too. So I was just at a conference yesterday in which a paper on food security in rural America during COVID was presented. And it was a qualitative study, and the families in the study described how for a lot of them, meal times during this time have been the kids eat first, and if there's any food left over, I eat. And so you can imagine how important these strategies for food security have been to parents' ability to support remote learning. And there were 5% of schools that even went beyond that and had food pantries which they found ways to keep open during building closure. So one of the things that we highlighted in the report that we released in August was the ways that schools partnered with local organizations or partnered with their communities to distribute needed resources along with food. So about 1/3 of the schools in our data set engaged in external partnerships like this. So this is a breakdown of the type of partnerships that we know about. I suspect that this is pretty underreported actually, since we were relying on things that the districts said they did on their websites, and maybe they didn't put them on their websites. But in this chart, you can see the commitment that some school districts made to trying to find ways to get families needed basic items that leveraged that daily or weekly contact that they were having with them through meal provision. So some partnered with local organizations to provide books, and some became a receiving site for donated toiletries or formula or other items that they could then distribute back to community members who needed them. And some of them even made sure that families had like special food for specific holidays that occurred during the closure. And in this, I think you can see the commitment that many school districts had, even in the context of crisis, to supporting families' basic needs within their sphere of influence. But on some of the other measures that we looked at, or in some of the other domains that we looked at, we start to see how spatial inequality affects the ability of schools to be a support to their families during this time. So this next part of the talk is going to be telling a story about spatial inequality using our data. So one area that we knew even before the pandemic was a challenge, right, was the digital divide in rural Maine. So this is data from Broadband Now. That's an organization that advocates for more equitable broadband coverage, about high-speed internet coverage in the state. And as you can see, there are critical gaps in coverage. And then more rural areas of the state are disproportionately affected by those gaps. So classic spatial justice issue. Our data suggests that these inequities had an effect on the resources that schools provided to families to support their access to the internet during building closure. So while we only have information on which schools provided resources to families, not access on the data, access itself, we see disparities across the urban-rural continuum in providing information on low or no-cost internet services. So one of the things that we'll be looking at during phase 2 of the project is what the drivers were behind this disparity from the perspective of school leaders. And one reason that we suspect that it might be related to the actual quality of these services for our most remote regions is the huge disparity within rural districts on providing information about these services to their students and families. So rural fringe, rural distant, rural remote are 3 ways that we classify districts in order to describe how far they are from an urban center, because, you know, like urban centers are the center of everything, right? As you can see, remote rural school districts provided information on these options to their families at a much lower rate than even other types of rural districts. And you can imagine that even as major companies were providing low or no cost internet offers, I mean, I think we all probably saw those like Comcast and Spectrum and other low cost offers that were going around in March and April. If those services don't work consistently in your local area, providing that information to your families isn't very useful. And so one of the things we'll be looking at much more closely is around this gap. But one thing that we do know is that there were rural districts that approached this problem as creatively as they could, right? So 1 in 4 rural fringe and rural districts and rural distant districts provided information to families on where they could access Wi-Fi in parking lots, either at the school site itself or in the community in partnership with local businesses and libraries. And one standout example from the spring of providing a resource to schools in order to do this was this map that was put together by Network Maine of public Wi-Fi signals throughout the state, which some schools shared with their families in addition to providing parking lot Wi-Fi at their school sites. But overall in this domain of internet access, we see significant challenges associated with spatial inequality that schools were not positioned well to overcome on their own. So another domain where we saw real differences by urbanicity were mental health resources provided by schools. So rurality, more than any of the other factors that we looked at, seemed to be related to communication about mental health resources to students and families. So in this chart, for example, you can see that information about telehealth and counseling services was more prevalent in communities that were closer to urban centers and more densely populated, despite the fact that telehealth services are supposed to be a measure to help overcome barriers related to distance and transportation access. And when we compare all types of mental health resources provided by schools to family during building closure by rural versus suburban districts, we see that on every measure, except for child abuse and domestic violence hotlines, suburban districts across the board provided resources at a higher rate than rural districts. So a lot of these things don't make intuitive sense, that they would be driven by space or differences across space, unless you start to think about the factors that might be moderating all of this, like whether or not a district employs a mental health professional, which is deeply related to inequitable funding structures, right? Because if you have a mental health professional who can work with a district leader to support communication about available mental health resources or coordinate communication directly with families about them, you might have different results. So one of the things that we'll be looking at as we get into phase 2 of this work is the difference that having a school counselor made in district crisis responses, along with a couple of other theories we have. So lastly, a domain that we looked at was other forms of environmental support for family well-being, like information on unemployment or housing assistance, or help with utilities, or information about childcare and immigration supports. And across the board, we found that there were a small subset of districts that were providing this type of information to families, particularly around unemployment, housing, utilities, and cash assistance. And the provision of this information didn't really seem to vary by urbanicity or really by any of the other factors that we looked at, which is interesting and is something that we'll be getting into as we get into phase 2. Why is it that some districts are providing this information to families, but not others? Is it related to the particular commitments of the district leader? Is it related to the makeup of the leadership team? Is it correlated with the kind of support staff in the district? Maybe the kinds of partnerships that they engage in? So we've got lots of different theories, and of course, I'll be interested in the theories that you all have as well. But there were a few examples that jumped out in our review of district practices on these environmental supports. So one that particularly jumped out to me was coastal Down East districts providing specific information on unemployment for the self-employed targeted at their fishing families, right? Or districts with particularly active community organizations that were clearly partnering with the district to help coordinate services to families. So one of the things that we'll be looking to report on in phase 2 is how these partnerships work and what kinds of inputs they need so that every district in Maine can engage in these kinds of comprehensive supports, both in the context of crisis and not in the context of crisis. So for me, one of the main takeaways here is that there is a lot that school districts in Maine have been doing to fight COVID-related inequity. And there are also a lot of innovative practices that could afford to spread more widely. And so the question we have to ask ourselves next is, knowing where some of these gaps are, how do we become that agent of structural change for our community and in our school? And I can imagine that as I'm saying this, a lot of your reaction is, Kat, oh my God, I am so tired. You do not know how tired I am. I am out there making it happen for my students and my community every single day. And my answer to that is, first, I know. And second of all, this is a long haul fight. I don't like the metaphor of the marathon because God knows I would never run one. But instead, I like the analogy of yoga. Yoga, when it's done right, is a practice. And you show up every day with your body exactly as it is right now, and you practice. And sometimes that means pushing yourself, and sometimes it just means showing up, but it's a commitment. And it's about where we choose to put our attention, even when times are tough. So Sweeney Winchief, a critical race scholar at Montana State University, said at a talk I attended once, "Power flows where attention goes." And Paul Gorski also thinks about equity work through a lens of where our attention goes. He writes, "Equity is a process through which we ensure that policies and practices and institutional cultures and ideologies are actively equitable, purposefully attending to the interests of students and families to whose interests we have attended inequitably." So to support our ability as educators to focus our attention on inequity consistently and loudly, even in the midst of all the other things that we're told might be more important, Gorski and his colleagues have developed several principles of equity literacy, which I often use myself as a gut check for my progress in this work. And I can't talk about all the principles today because we don't have enough time, but I want to highlight a few, although they're definitely worth a read in full. So the first principle that he advocates for is to start by cultivating an equity ideology, meaning an understanding of the world that recognizes bias in all of its forms. And I did an activity last year at a high school in northern Maine with faculty in which we tried to list all of the ways that money might be a barrier to participation or a stressor for their students throughout the day. And we listed dozens of things because we know them, right? We know what they are. But the thing is, are we attending to them? So another example, one of the things that many of my students shared with me this spring was the way in which seeing their students in their homes challenged their assumptions about what their students' home lives looked like. So one question that I'm asking them now as we move into the fall is, your assumptions have changed. Now, how are you mobilizing your resources and time differently in your practice? And one of the things that I've been thinking about is, I think many Maine communities are grappling with the fact that if we repeated that activity that I did with that high school in northern Maine, trying to list all the barriers or stressors for our students of color, we probably couldn't do it, or at least a lot of those of us among us who are white couldn't do it. And so one question is, how can white educators learn how to see the school day through those students and families' eyes? So as an example, this was a headline that I saw in April, and this piqued me right away because my rural lens is so like overdeveloped, you know. And at the time, I remember tweeting how irritating I found this, the discovery of the rural digital divide as part of the pandemic, when so many Maine communities have been living with it for years now with little traction despite policy advocacy to address it, right? But speaking for myself, I often find that as a white woman, my ability to see racial inequity is compromised by my whiteness, that I have to actively practice looking at the world through a racialized lens, to stop talking and listen to the people of color in my community, to sharpen my ability to see the ways that systemic racism is operating in the spaces that I move through and the spaces that I study. So let's take this differential infection rate of our community members of color as an example. So how are our schools perceiving how families of color are weighing the safety of school return for their children? Are we extending compassion to those families in our policies and practices around hybrid and remote learning? And are we extending the same compassion to them that we would to families choosing to keep their children home for other reasons? So Gorski also identifies the importance of looking to change systemic barriers rather than building up the fortitude of individual kids to overcome those barriers on their own. So he's been an outspoken critic of deficit ideology, or locating problems in kids themselves rather than the systems that surround them. And as rural educators, I think this is actually deeply relatable, right? Because the story that I told you before about education reformers seeing all the ways that rurality presented problems to the ways that they envision modern school reform, rather than designing schools to fit the unique strengths of rural communities, was all about fixing rural communities and not addressing the systemic challenges that rural America is facing. And so when we start to look for deficit ideology in education trends, we often find it in places where we think we're doing work that will help. So the best example I can think of is around social emotional learning curricula, because some of them, not all of them, are a lot about emphasizing student compliance and self-regulation rather than making space for students to talk about and have voice in the classroom in ways that are authentic and sometimes messy. So one of my favorite counterexamples or counter narratives about this comes to us from the Transforming Rural Experience in Education program, which partners with Maine schools to center student voice as a key part of social emotional learning and trauma responsive schooling. So they introduced this idea of some days to the schools that they work in. Every student and teacher got to write down on a piece of paper something that they wished would happen someday at school. And when Tree first introduced this, there was this doubt that this would work, you know, mostly on the part of adults. There was this fear by adults that, well, what if the kids ask for things that we can't provide? Or what if they ask for unreasonable things? But that wasn't what happened. The things that kids wanted were like the fifth grader who wanted to have recess at the same time as first graders because her cousin is in that class and she never gets to see her. Or another kid wanted her mom to come into school and read her favorite Spanish storybook so that other kids could hear it. Or another kid wanted to sit in the principal's chair and eat M&Ms. So the Tree resource coach made different students' some days happen every day. And there was this big board at the front of the school announcing right when you walked in whose someday it was. So at the end of the year, when Tree did a school climate survey, the number of students reporting agree or strongly agree with I belong at this school jumped from 64% to 91%. And the number of students reporting my teachers ask about my ideas and listen to what I say rose from 68% to 91%. And like whether or not a kid gets to sit in the principal's chair and eat M&Ms might not feel like a social justice issue, you know, but legitimating the wishes of children in the school environment and allowing that avenue for them to bring in whatever they wanted, their language, their culture, their love of the outside, had a bigger influence on their feelings of mattering than most cell curriculum. And it was an approach that allowed young people to shape school into a place that they wanted to be, rather than trying to fit their ways of being into a place that was designed without them. And to me, that's the principle that's at the heart of fixing injustice and not fixing kids. And so again, you might be saying, Kat, you know, that sounds great, but as a teacher, I have so little control over the structures that I'm working in right now. I didn't get to decide if I teach face-to-face or online. I don't even get to decide if my kids come to school or stay home. I just feel like I have no voice right now in the midst of all of this uncertainty. And to that, Gorski might say, The first step is reflection, seeing the world through our equity ideology. But then the second step is finding ways to take action that changes the structures within which we're having to make these decisions. So determining where it is that we can have a voice and where we can deploy our influence. And you're right, there are a lot of arenas right now that are outside of all of our control. But one thing I always remember as a kid who grew up in a household that was pretty constantly in chaos is I have control over me. I have the power to reevaluate what I believe is most important in my own work, and I have the ability to ask hard questions to the people in my workplace about what they tell me is important if I think it's perpetuating an inequitable system. And I always have the power to say in a meeting, you know, are the needs of our most vulnerable students and families being attended to in this policy or practice? So the thing that's so hard about this is that we have to get comfortable with like being that person. And when I work with students in our educational leadership program, for a lot of them, this is the part of leadership that they most fear, right? The possibility of saying or doing something that other people aren't going to like, or that makes them uncomfortable. But the problem is, in the same way that rural Americans shouldn't have to wait for the country to get comfortable with the idea that they need access to 21st century utilities and services in order to thrive, like internet and access to mental health services, our students and their families shouldn't have to wait until people feel comfortable having their ideas about meritocracy in a highly unequal society or their privileges named and challenged. So there are two parts of the direct confrontation principle. One piece is your own comfort with confrontation, and the second piece is your strategies for doing the confronting. So let's first talk about confrontation. One of the things that I encourage my students who've identified that comfort with conflict is one of their leadership growth edges is to encourage them to not to try to learn to get comfortable with it in high stakes situations. So that's not a good place to learn skills. We wouldn't ask our students to practice their skills for the first time on a high stakes assessment. And so we shouldn't expect ourselves to either. But we do need to create opportunities for ourselves to learn in small and low stakes situations. So maybe it's actively bringing up an equity issue in a PLC meeting, or inviting a colleague to talk it over with you in a one-on-one conversation, or even just trying out a new way of doing things in your class and then weathering that privileged parent's complaint about the redistribution of your focus or practices. And once you get comfortable holding the discomfort that comes up for you and engaging with others in these situations, you'll be more able to hold that discomfort in bigger situations. And you'll be able to eliminate that mental flinch that happens when you think about raising an issue or putting a policy in place that you think others might disagree with, but you know is more equitable. So the second piece of this is the conflict itself. Anytime you call for change of any kind, not just related to equity, there are going to be resistors. So we have to shift the goalposts. This isn't about changing the hearts and minds of the resistors, although we can't afford to leave them out of conversations and dialogue that we have about this. We are likely, one of the things that we have to accept is that we're likely not going to get consensus. We just need, at least initially, to get enough support for change to reach a tipping point. And as you get more comfortable asking those hard questions and holding your own and others' discomfort, your sphere of influence as a leader will expand. So this is the kind of leadership that we need in hard times when even talking about these issues can feel really polarizing and deeply challenging and even uncivil sometimes. And there are going to be those days that I talked about in the beginning where you can't stop doom scrolling on your phone and feeling overwhelmed and maybe apathetic, and you aren't going to want to do it. And when we have those days, at least when I have those days, I try to remember that I have the power to become a threat to inequity and that I have the power to define my sphere of influence. And so I just want to say thanks to the Island Institute again for having me. I've included some resources here if you want to look more at our project or if you want to read up on the Equity Literacy Institute. And yeah, I'm just really looking forward to engaging with you around some of these ideas.
Pat, thank you so much. So much to think about. And I want to invite people to either just raise your hand if you have questions or put them in the chat, or even if you don't have a question, but a connection or a thought, something that you want to just hear Kat talk a little bit more about. There was a lot there. Oda, did I get? Oh, you're muted. I'm sorry.
Okay, unmute. Yeah, you did a good job pronouncing my name.
I'm sorry.
So I sort of came in at the tail end, and I apologize if you already went over this and I missed some of it, and I'll probably watch the recording later as well. But I wanted to put to Kat, like, a lot of what we're talking about, equity, it's about students and it's about our communities, but even within faculty, like, I'm in a new school for me. I'm a multicultural, multilingual person, and Maine is just a very white state in general. So, tools and tactics when, like, you are potentially the only non-white person on your faculty, like, as I feel like for sure there's allyship and that sort of thing, but I guess I'm starting to recognize, like, just even as faculty, yes, of course I want to help my students, but just navigating that, and just not having a lot of diversity on faculty, because, like, I don't always want to be the one with, like, a different viewpoint standing up saying, especially as a newer person, you know what I mean?
Mm.
So just if you can speak to that, or, I'd also be happy to connect with you separately outside of the space and be able to collaborate on thoughts around that. Yeah, I don't know, just putting that out there.
Well, I think the first thing I want to say is that's really hard, right? Like, the situation that you just described is really hard. I think that I don't know that I have any answers, right? But one thing that it makes me think of is, like, one of the things that I tell my students in any change initiative, right? Like, where we're pushing our colleagues, that's a difficult situation to be in, especially when you're a teacher, because it's a very flat structure in most schools. And if you, like, put yourself out in front in any way, there's definitely always people who are willing to be like, no, you get back. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so who are the people that are coming up to you after the meeting where you said something and are being like, oh man, I'm so glad you said that?
Well,
you know what I mean?
It's even sort of preemptive. I'm asking this question kind of preemptively because I sort of feel like I am hesitant to even speak up in meetings, because it's sort of twofold, well, threefold even, being, multicultural, being younger, kind of being on the younger side of teaching, and then just being new, 100% new. So you're sort of feeling things out. The teaching landscape, teaching is a profession that has a really hard time with attrition for, there's like the 5-year thing. I'm an art teacher, so I love teaching art. I mean, that's the best thing in the world. But for me, but just that challenge of, wanting to advocate for my students and community, but also being new and feeling that out. But then, what we teach our students, we should also be embodying ourselves. And we have to, faculty, we have to not challenge, but hold ourselves up to the same accountability and up to the same standards and principles. And I just find that very challenging sometimes when, I feel like I almost have more in common with my high school students than with a lot of faculty, just because of age. I mean, I'm 10 years older than them, but I'm still feel like just generationally, we have more in common. We speak more of a similar language than a lot of my colleagues. So that's, I don't know if anyone else has even just that experience just with, age and generational, and the world is changing, really rapidly. A lot of things that when I was growing up were super acceptable or just like not really looked at or thought about, are now being brought up to the forefront, which are great. But, it's kind of like what you're talking about with, like, early adopters, pioneers. Like, I feel like looking at your graph, like, I'm just like, oh, I'm already, like, I feel like pioneer level. And then it's like, oh, how can I work with this range to be gentle and understanding and empathic, but also like, okay, this is the work that needs to be done, and we need to like step it up and be accountable with the world as it is and what we know, and how we can be better, do better, So I don't know, maybe that's a conversation for another time. I've just been thinking a lot about this leading up to this conference, and I'm excited about some of the further workshops and stuff, but yeah, anyway.
Well, I just really appreciate you doing that reflecting out loud so that we can all kind of hear like what's happening for you as a teacher in this space who wants to do this work, right? And it like positioned sort of particularly the way you are, right? And I mean, I think, and I don't need to be the only one talking here, but, other people can jump in. But I mean, one thing that I've noticed is that, we could think about the school, right, as operating simultaneously through a couple of different lenses, right? We've got kind of like the structural lens, and that sort of limits what we can do in particular kinds of ways. We've got the sort of relationships that we have with one another and how that structures and the kinds of opportunities that we see are in front of us. And then there's like this political realm too, right? And when I work with my students, the political realm often feels the least comfortable to them as a place for them to do work. Like they're attracted to teaching because it's a highly relational type of work. And so that's the sphere that they feel most comfortable acting in. And so then the question I just become is, as you get into this political work in your school, right? Because that's essentially what this is. What are the risks? What are the opportunities? And what are you afraid of? Do you know what I mean? And answering those questions for yourself might help as a starting place.
Yeah. It's a lot to balance and gauge, and I find that often in a lot of spaces, that unless I'm actively seeking out places with more diversity, and even within spaces with some diversity in one way, often I show up as like, I am the one of two or three people that, have this experience. And I'm multicultural. So I actually have, with my family, it's like half of my family is white and half of it's not white. And it's also like American and not American. And there's just so many layers, and also gender stuff and, sexuality stuff, which like, I feel like my high school students, like we all just grew up, more in this thing where everything is just very layered and intersectional and accepted. And then, but like showing up in places where, I sort of am either cast into like, oh, you represent all people that are different and other non, mainstream, or it's like, oh, we don't, your viewpoint is too, not, maybe this is more my internalizing it, but it's like, okay, do I stand up and become this like very visible, almost like easily targetable person, or do I just, stay under the radar and just, so it's sort of that tension point. And yeah, it's looking at it as, risks versus opportunities versus like, what are the goals? What is the long game? What's the, what kind of environment am I trying to help engender? I was even thinking, this is so, like, this is just a small example, and I don't know if anyone else has done it, but one of the further workshops, or maybe I already missed it, was about like making more inclusive classrooms. And I was thinking like, oh, I would love to put up like on, my door or part of the wall in the art room, like this is a, all genders inclusive space, or like everyone's welcome here, or trans inclusive, like just very like, even not to just, I think seeing that, like when I go into spaces where I see that, I'm like, oh, this feels like a better space, even if, it's not necessarily talking about me, but it's just that like, this is something that's seen and recognized and acknowledged. And, it just makes this like blanket umbrella of like, we're not just ignoring something or not talking about something, it's like the fact that we put she, her, or he, him,
Right.
or they. So it's like, I don't have to assume anything about anyone.
Yeah, I want to jump in. Thank you so much. Just looking at the time.
Sorry.
No, it's so good. You're pulling on so many things that we've already talked about this morning and that different people have touched on, but we did promise 15-minute breaks.
Okay.
So if people want to leave, please, thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Kat. But if you want to stay and continue the conversation, please do that as well. And I saw May made a comment. I hear you, and I know that you have a lot to say on this subject, May. But just I think I want to just remind people that we have resources from all of the workshops. So whether you missed one or went to another one at the same time as one that's being referenced, all of the workshop, resources and PowerPoints will be in the shared Google Drive that Krista keeps sending us, but you'll get it a lot from us. So I think you were talking about the Out Maine one, perhaps that happened earlier today. But the PowerPoint, the recording, those will all be available so that you can really get the resources that you want and you need. So so thanks for referencing that.
Well, I'll also jump in and say that the next session happening in this room, Zoom link A, is the Speak Up at School strategy, navigating challenging topics in the classroom, put on by the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine. And I am going to sign off and head over to link B, where the Island Readers and Writers folks will be presenting on using visual thinking strategies in the classroom to help students think about equity. So I'm going to sign off, but the agenda is in the chat.
Great, thank you. Sorry, this is just that transition time. If we were in person, a small group of us would stay and keep talking, which we certainly can do. And then we're transitioning to the next session, and I'm going to let the next presenter in, or somebody else just did. So anyway, that's where things stand. So thank you. Yeah. I got to take a minute and make sure I know which room I'm supposed to be in, because I can't remember. I get so into the one I'm in. So please keep talking if you'd like to.
Kat, can I ask you a question? I don't know if you
Sure.
can hear. My name's Lindsay. I'm actually a graduate of the Educational Leadership Program at UMaine, so it's really exciting to see you there. Are you offering any courses or anything specifically around your work around equity in schools?
Well, so we offer courses in both our master's and our doctoral programs on like the social context of schooling and like getting deeply into social inequities as they manifest in schools in Maine, and then also more broadly nationally. So yeah, I do teach a bunch of different classes on this at the university for our graduate students, which you all are welcome to get in touch with me about if that's something that interests you.
You were speaking my language for sure. Just like I live and work in the Cranberry Isles, and I taught here for many years. I've tried very hard to not work in this school anymore, and I'm not able to ever get away. This year I've been sucked back into a teaching position. And I'm saying that because I often just feel so exhausted from this work in a rural place where the school, like you said, is the only public organization that we have in our town. And it is responsible for so much. And I feel the weight of that so acutely. And so I just really, it was really nice to hear what you were saying. I was like, yes. And just wondering what do we do with all that information? Like, we know that, we live it, it's the lived experience, and where do we go from there? How do we get the support we need? And I know like Yvonne and Robin and all of my TLC folks that I see here on the screen, we've tried to create that for ourselves. It's really hard to sustain it. So like, what do we do?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't have the silver bullet here, nobody does, right? But I mean, I know one of the things that I've spent a lot of time talking to the folks in our educational leadership program about is like, how do we find that third way, right? Like, we've got all this stuff that we need to juggle over here that in the institutional realm is telling us is really important. And then we've got our communities over here, and we know that there's like such important work that has to happen here. And so it's like, how do we satisfy the monster over here while still doing the work we care about over here. And I think some of it starts with, just leadership, right? Building leadership. And so putting, I always say, like, you care about these issues, become a principal, that's like.
Right. It just about killed me.
Right. Yeah.
Literally.
But like, it's so hard, I think, as a teacher to kind of push these issues from like yourself, although I think many teachers successfully do, but because schools are so hierarchical, it's like you almost need that buffer, really making space for this work and protecting teachers so that they can have that creative space to do it.
Okay. Thank you. My little cuties are now calling me, so I have to run, but thank you very much, Kat. I'll look to see what you're offering for courses this year. Thank you.
Thanks. I wanted to reflect back that question that you posed, Kat, are the needs of the most vulnerable students and families being attended to? That resonates with me because I think my brain goes there a lot, but I don't always articulate it in that way. And, Yvonne, your opening remarks this morning of even speaking about, like, as a school counselor with college tours, like meeting, the kids whose families are already taking them across the country or across the region, like, you don't have to worry about taking those kids on tours. You want to, like, make sure you're showing students options, like for ones who don't have their families, showing them options. I did not explain that well. But like, I think as public schools need to be able to serve all students, so are the vulnerable students being left behind or supported? I feel like that's something that a lot of, at least theoretically, administrators, teachers can get behind that concept. And the other thing, just like as a strategy for myself as a young person in a workplace, it has often been like referring to things that already exist. Even if it's not always practiced or not always like remembered by all, like the fact that it already exists and I didn't create it, it just gives it more weight to be like connecting and influencing. So that's all that I wanted to add as like a little strategy that I've come up with.
Thanks, Robin. Yeah, I feel like I should probably add that I'm the second, maybe the youngest member of the College of Education right now. So I deeply relate to that feeling.
I'm here at 55 to tell you I used to relate to that feeling, and eventually that is one of the like intersectionality things that does go away. The crow's feet come, the gray hair, it all starts to change. I used to be the youngest too a long time ago.
That's funny. I'm curious for other teachers, other people, how much of yourself do you bring, like for you, what is the line of like, I'm being professional and I'm also showing up as my whole self, because obviously the most important thing for me is to be as accessible to all my students. And I don't want my own a lot of students, they're still figuring out what they're thinking, or it's more about what their families believe and think. And they're just in that environment. They're not, that's not their decision, but it's more like, how are we sculpting like their own thought process and critical thinking skills? And also, how do we keep enough of, okay, I'm here for you. I'm here to, help cultivate your skills and interests and things like that. But also I'm showing up as my whole self, or as much of my whole self as I can. I'm curious to hear what other educators feel about that, or just your experience.
I can jump in. I think I started my career in education thinking that I needed to show up as much less myself so that I could be more accessible, just being a minority teacher with a population that I was teaching that was primarily white. But I have learned that I have to show up in the way in which I want my students to show up. So if I want my students to be as genuine and as real and as open and as honest as possible, I've got to push myself to do that every day. And not in a way that's maybe frightening, but in a way that, you know, also is simultaneously holding space for them. Like, see, I can be here, I can be myself, and I can also make sure that there's space in this place of ours for you to do the same.
I think many of us that work in 1 and 2 room schoolhouses, it's, you are a member of the community. Like, everyone sees everything you do all the time, the anonymity at all. I think it's hard to kind of figure out, I think it's hard for a lot of teachers to figure out how much of themselves they can reveal kind of to their communities, because they want to remain accessible to all of these parents, right? And it's such a small community. And so I certainly kind of feel what you're saying in my experience. I too may like struggled and decided that I needed to, like, the things that were really important to me about social justice and racial justice, like, it was really important for me to integrate that into my curriculum, even though I was teaching such a small group of almost entirely white kids. And as a white person, right, and a predominantly white community. And it was received, all of the work I did, I feel like was received, in my experience, received well. There's a parent on here who got to experience some of that, but it was always really, right there, it was always really tenuous. Like, I would really have to think through how I was going to present. Like, we had a person who's trans come in and do a multi-week workshop with our students. And some of them were very young, you know, 2nd grade. And so, you know, presenting that information, I gave kind of like a broad overlook of what we were going to be talking about, but it felt very risky when I did it. But I feel like I've never regretted committing to what I believe in, even if it's created some tensions or difficult conversations. I feel like maybe that's my advice to you, is that even if it does present challenges, it's worth it to, like, to be honest and to do your best, do the best work you can do.
So thank you, Kat, and everyone who stayed to keep discussing.